Hey everybody, real quick, if you need a recap of season 1 of Pennyworth, I've got you. Just hit the tab in the upper right hand corner. Now, season 2 picks up 1 year after the events of season 1. The good news for Thomas Wayne is he has survived. He's returned back to the United States and is continuing to work for the CIA. But the bad news is things aren't going as well in England. Lord Harwood had escaped, and he brought the Raven Society back bigger than ever. In fact, now they're called the Raven Union, and they're taking over England one by one. He aims to establish himself as a fascist military dictator, and he's got a lot of support, like that of the army. He's got all the tanks, most of the soldiers, and it's got the Queen kind of floundering. The Queen is still kind of in charge, but the real power is split up between 20 delegates that are led by the new Prime Minister, Archbishop Potter. To be blunt, it's an absolute dumpster fire. One of the places the Raven Union hasn't taken over yet is London, and that's where Alfie is, although it's a much different looking London. The bridges are destroyed, there's checkpoints, and the club that Alfie works at is located in the neutral zone, with the idea being that no matter if you're a Raven Union or the other guys, who is basically everybody else, the no-name league, the non-fascists, anybody who isn't down with Harwood. But even though it's supposed to be the neutral zone, every once in a while a fight breaks out in the club, and that happens when somebody insults Lord Harwood and one of the Raven Union guys comes to his defense. Alfie has to step in, but then Alfie notices that there's a meeting going on between Martha Kane and Inspector Aziz. Martha's been working for Aziz, who has been promoted to the League's High Council. And while normally that might be a good thing, in this case, the no-name League side of things is losing this war, so it might not be great. But Martha and Aziz have shown up on the club because they need Alfie to do a job for him. It's a kidnapping job. They want Alfie to kidnap a guy named Colonel John Salt of the Union Militia. He used to run grocery stores back before the war, and now, according to Aziz, they want him because he's, quote, available. Alfie charges a pretty penny for this, which Martha takes exception to because she feels like Alfie should be helping them out with the war, but Alfie's just helping himself. And once he gets the 10% and Martha and Aziz take off, Alfie tells Dave Boy and Baza about the job, but also about the fact that they only need a couple more to get out of London. Alfie still has plans on heading to the United States, and he's been stashing away his money in order to do so. At this point for Alfie, it's money over morals. But even with these grandiose plans of heading across the pond, Alfie still has his mother to think about, who is all alone after his dad killed himself. And she doesn't seem too keen on the idea of going over to the States. Alfie's pretty surprised when she brings up the fact that the Raven Union members look at Mr. Pennyworth as a martyr. So she figures that she'll be taken care of once the Raven Union takes over London. Which, by the way, should only be a matter of maybe weeks. But to Alfie, he wants to get out of there because London is just full of bad memories. Once he stops finally arguing with his mother about the plans, he, Baza, and Dave Boy meet up, and they head to the location of where Salt is going to be. He goes to meet his mistress at this farm, and they don't know when, but he goes there at least twice a week, so they kind of just have to head there and lay low. The next day, Salt shows up. He heads in, he greets his mistress, and then he gets down to work, interrogating and eventually killing George Orwell for his writing. The dude seems pretty twisted. He then heads upstairs, starts having sex with his mistress, and that's when Alfie, Dave Boy, and Baza sneak in. They take Salt in at gunpoint, put him in the back of their truck, and then they head to go meet up with Aziz and make the exchange. Salt does his best to try to talk his way out of the situation, even offering to pay them more than whatever Aziz is paying them to do this. But Alfie needs to collect the other 90%. Then Salt recognizes Pennyworth. He tells him how his father was a hero of his, and Alfie says, yeah, he was a hero of mine too. When they get to the exchange point, Alfie arrives a little bit early, which gives Alfie and Salt even more time to talk. Salt trying to continue the conversation about Mr. Pennyworth, and Alfie wanting to change the topic, which they finally do, to what makes Alfie tick, which is money. Alfie is real appreciative when Aziz and his car roll up because it puts a stop to this awkward conversation. Aziz hands over the money, Alfie hands over Salt, and then Alfie, Boz, and Dave Boy head back to the club. But Aziz didn't get very far away before his car is attacked. The captors don't kill anybody, but they knock Aziz and his partners out, and they take Salt back. So Aziz definitely has a mole on his hands. One person who wasn't at this meeting was Martha Kane. She's at home helping the resistance when she gets a knock at the door, and she's real surprised because it's Thomas Wayne. She kicks her two guests out so the two can talk privately, and the two start getting caught up. He's very surprised that Martha is now a lieutenant who has her own unit. She is also surprised at how quickly he's recovered from the gunshots. Thomas then gets into the reason why he came. He tells Martha that she's preparing to make a last desperate stand for a lost cause. The League is not going to win. They're going to be going up against tanks and using tiny pistols. London will fall. But Martha is convinced that the League is still going to win, and it gets the two bickering over the fact. What gets Martha really annoyed is the fact that she knows if the United States would just step in and back the no-name League, they would absolutely win. But Thomas tells her they're staying neutral. When in reality, yeah, they're staying neutral, but in name only. Thomas has returned to London as a station chief with direct orders to back the Raven Union because they're going to end up winning. He doesn't tell Martha any of this or the fact that he actually told the U.S. government they should be backing the no-name League. He's just giving his old friend a warning. After they bicker for a little bit about this, Martha realizes that this wasn't probably what Thomas came over for. She feels like he came over to pick up where they left off, so she starts making moves on him. But he pulls back and says, "No, I'm actually engaged to a lucky girl named Betsy Van Wyck." Martha stands up and asks, "All right, what's up? I mean, you're a CIA spy. You didn't come here to get laid, so why are you here?" And he tells her, "I just came to warn you. You're in the middle of the road. A steamroller is heading your way, and you're ignoring it." Martha, though, doesn't think she needs help. And as Thomas is leaving, he reminds her, "I'm here for you as a friend. So if you need something, you can ask." And then he takes off. The next day, Alfie heads to the club to do his job, and Aziz meets him there before it opens. Alfie has heard about the attack on Aziz, so he makes sure his friend is okay. And then he asks if there's any news on Salt. Aziz tells him that he was seen back at Union HQ that morning. The question then becomes, who did it? Who freed Salt? Alfie says he has no idea, but he'll poke around and try to get some answers. And while Aziz doesn't come right out and say it, he insinuates that the mole is Alfie, which Alfie takes offense to because Alfie figures if anybody in this situation would be the mole, it would be Aziz himself. After all, he's done Alfie dirty on a few occasions. He's also turned his back on more than one person. It actually gets Aziz to admit, "This is my fault and I'm seeking someone to blame." Aziz admits that he's just annoyed because Salt was a big fish. He was close to the leadership. It's actually information that he kept from Alfie because Alfie's prices are already pretty high, and he figured that if Alfie knew how big of a deal Salt was, he would up that price even more. Aziz then asks Alfie, "Did he mention anything to you while he was in your custody, like something called Storm Cloud?" And Alfie tells him no. But then he asks, "What the hell is Storm Cloud?" And Aziz brushes it aside, saying, it's probably nothing, just rumors. It's not nothing, though. Storm Cloud is an attack that the Raven Union is working on that's basically a nerve gas, killing people within 11 seconds. Right now, it's a work in progress because, as Salt tells the scientists working on it, if Storm Cloud is put into effect, it's got to make the casualties look like they all died peacefully. And right now, that is not the case. But Aziz's original hunch about Alfie ends up being true. Alfie knew exactly who took Salt. In fact, he went to war with the guy. His name was Captain Gulliver Troy, and he worked with Alfie to double dip, taking Salt's money in order to let him free. It's not really noble, but the money does get Alfie closer to the States. Gully brings up the fact that he and Alfie should work together again, but Alfie says, nah, that was a one-off. They then have a drink and end the night. But one person we haven't really talked about is Bette Sykes. She's a captain in the Raven Union, and her job is to bring in prisoners, interrogate them, and hopefully get them to confess. One such prisoner, Katie Browning, isn't really giving Sykes any information. So she brings in one of her bosses, a guy named Sutcliffe. And Sutcliffe hints at the fact that he's going to rape Katie, or at least do something to her. But Bette Sykes doesn't allow that. She ends up bludgeoning him with a kettle. It's not out of the goodness of her heart, though. She takes offense when Sutcliffe tells her to put the kettle on. She feels like that's completely beneath her. She's not the tea lady. But after killing him, she escorts Katie out of the building, and the two then walk to a bus stop, and Katie is really confused. In episode 2, both factions, the Raven Union and the League, are hard at work trying to figure out how they're going to win this war. The Union, in particular, is doing pretty well. They're pretty close to victory. As Lord Harwood and Francis Gaunt are talking about strategic plans, in walks Salt with the latest on the chemical warfare. And this is the first time that Francis Gaunt is hearing about any of this, and she is really turned off. Lord Harwood makes her aware of it, but he can't believe that she's not for this because, after all, they are in the midst of a war. Francis wants him to put an end to it, but the way he looks at it, this is the same thing as using tanks. After a little bit of back and forth, eventually Harwood agrees to put a stop to it, but you get the sense that he's not going to put a stop to it. On the other side, Inspector Aziz does have a meeting to go to with the figureheads of the league, but before he does that, he goes and meets with Martha, because they are aware that Thomas Wayne went to visit her. He asks what the nature of it was, and she tells him that he showed up because the bosses are staying neutral. And just like how the United States is staying neutral in name only, but planning on cultivating a relationship with the Raven Union, Aziz, without any knowledge of that, wants to do the same thing with the United States. Yeah, okay, they're neutral, but it doesn't mean we can't cultivate a relationship. So he's pretty annoyed when he hears that Martha Kane told him to go piss off. He wants her to reestablish that relationship that they previously had so they can possibly get in good with the United States and use their resources to try to win this war. He then heads to the war room where there's 20 people, including Aziz, the Prime Minister, the Queen, John Ripper, and a few others arguing about what they're going to do next to try to win. But Alfie doesn't care about the war anymore because he is a week away from leaving for the States. He almost has enough money, and he's going to take one more job, and then he's gone, planning on leaving with Dave Boy and Baza and just disappearing, not really telling anybody. Well, he needs to tell one person at least, Sandra. They're kind of seeing each other. After celebrating with the boys, he goes and tells his mom after his shift, but she's not excited for this news. She doesn't want to leave. They start arguing about the matter, and in a fit of rage, she yells at him, saying that she can't even look at Alfie without thinking about what happened with his father. Alfie doesn't really seem to take it personal, just telling his mother, we have to try to move forward. But Alfie's mother doesn't want to try to move forward. She wants to live her life in England. So he's going to have to continue to work on his mom if he wants her to come to the States with him. Next day, Alfie has to tell the other person who he cares about that he's planning on leaving, and that's Sandra. But when it comes time to tell her, he can't bring himself to do it. He gets a welcome distraction, though, when Thomas Wayne walks into the club. He can't figure out what Thomas is there for. And Thomas is there to meet with somebody. He had an interesting meeting with his superior earlier in the day where she tells him that they have a problem with the hydrogen bomb that they're building. The problem is the public doesn't like it, and the nuclear disarmament folks have done a great job of painting the states as warmongers. So they need to fight back with their PR machine. Now, the top anti-nuclear campaigner in England just so happens to be Archbishop Potter, the Prime Minister. This guy has a lot of moral authority, and it's going to be a problem to kill him. So they need to convince him to change his ways a bit. It's worth mentioning Thomas Wayne doesn't really enjoy any of this. But he's got bosses, they've got orders, so he's going to have to go through with it. There's also one other thing that his superior tells him, and she prefaces it by saying, Thomas, I know you're not going to like this, but we never get an answer on what it could be. What it might be is the nature of his meeting that night at the club, because he meets with Aleister Crowley. Thomas doesn't really feel comfortable meeting with Aleister again, but he's going to need his particular services. He tells Aleister that his superiors have a proposal. They know that Aleister is really well connected in the Raven Union, but they also know that he's held at arm's length because he does the things that other people find repugnant. So they figure that a close friendship with a U.S. agency might boost his status in the Union. In order to get this relationship, Aleister Crowley is going to have to get the Archbishop in some hot water. A scandal or whatever it is, but it's going to drive him from the public life. If he does that, he's going to have that relationship that they just talked about. Aleister knows that it's not going to be easy to get to the Archbishop because he's a really popular guy. And after all, Aleister worships Satan. This guy's a bishop. But he says, consider it done. The next day, Crowley heads to the Archbishop's church and starts banging his head against a pew saying how much he needs help. A little while later, the Archbishop shows up, thinking that he's got this broken soul that he has to mend, but in reality, he's just being played by Aleister Crowley. The Archbishop knows exactly who Aleister is. He's a really popular guy, but he's open-minded. He tells him, I don't know what you're going through. I know who you worship, but I also know that that person is not real. He's the dog that ate your homework. So Alistair gives him a little bit of a taste, and that's all he needed. Once Alistair gives him a taste, he's hooked. As Alistair is busy seducing the Prime Minister, Alfie is getting ready for that night's performance at the club, which has to do with Sandra. And Sandra's got great news. She got accepted to sing at this place, and it's a big deal. They only accept the best singers, and it's great for her career. She's excited because it's in a couple of weeks, and she wants Alfie to come, but Alfie's planning on going to the States. It's another chance for Alfie to come clean, but he doesn't again. Alfie heads up to his office, and he sees Baza practicing poker because that's all they play in Las Vegas. But Baza can see that his friend is stressed out, and he tells him, you don't have to go. I mean, I'm going, but you can stay here. Be with your mother, be with Sandra. But Alfie doubles down that he is going to the States. There's then a phone call into the office, and it's Alfie's mother. But she lets him know that she was kidnapped, and the kidnappers want Alfie to bring $20,000 to this street corner, and they want him to do it alone. They know he's got the money, and if he doesn't do it, she's going to be killed that day. And $20K is the exact amount he has. This is all the money he was going to use to get to the States, but this is his mother after all. He doesn't think twice about it. So he heads to the location alone with a duffel bag full of cash. A car then pulls up. They tell him to throw the money in the car, but he says, no, I want to see my mom first. And the kidnapper tries to play tough with Alfie, but he says, I know you're not the guy in charge. Go back to your boss and tell them that if I don't see my mom first, you're not getting this bag of money. So the car takes off, and when the car pulls back up, there's now a driver and a guy in the passenger seat, and they tell Alfie to get in. As they're driving to the location where Alfie's mother is allegedly being kept, Alfie is able to get the gun from the driver and hold both of them at gunpoint, where they tell him that they don't know who's in charge. All they know is he calls himself Mr. X. They were just hired to do a job, and that's it. They also tell Alfie where his mother is, and that's when Alfie directs both of them to pull the car over. Dave Boy and Baza hop out, switching spots with them, and the trio head off to go save Alfie's mom. Alfie gets out of the car, and Dave Boy and Baza kind of hang back, pretending to be kidnappers. But the actual kidnappers are hanging outside of a trailer, and they tell Alfie that his mother is inside. They won't bring her out, but he says if you don't bring her out, you're not getting any money. They go back and forth with this, but eventually Alfie can hear his mother, confirms she's okay. But the back and forth with the kidnappers just gets too much, and Alfie says screw it, pulls out a gun, and Dave Boy, Baza, and Alfie get the jump on the kidnappers. They don't have it for very long, though, because Inspector Aziz and the police swoop in, and it creates enough confusion for the kidnappers to grab Alfie's bag of cash and get away. This, as Alfie runs into the trailer confirming his mother is okay, but the trailer is shot up by the cops. After a little bit of a firefight, Aziz tells his men to stand down, and he yells at Alfie to come out. Alfie asks him, what the hell are you doing here? And Aziz tells him, we were watching you, and we figured that you were meeting with the men who took Colonel Salt. These guys weren't them? And he's talking about the guys who just got away. Alfie can't believe that he would even suspect that, and he says, no, man, you're wrong, but that's beside the point. You screwed me over. They got away with my money. I showed up here because they kidnapped my mother. Dave Boy, Alfie, his mom, they just all start ripping into Aziz for being an idiot. And then finally, there's Bet Sykes and Katie Browning. Bet figures that she's just doing Katie a favor, protecting her while they get all of this mess sorted out, because she knows that the Union is going to be looking for Katie, figuring that she was the one who killed the guy back in the bunker. But she knows all she has to do is get to Lord Harwood and get all of this mess expunged. They headed to a bus stop because they need to get as far away from that location as possible. They get to a neighborhood that has been cleared out by the Raven Union, and they go to a house that's been abandoned. Posting up there where Bet handcuffs Katie to the banister and then goes out to try to get in touch with Lord Harwood. She finds out the hard way, though, that that's not going to be easy. She can't just call him up. He's a really powerful guy, and he's in the middle of a war. So even though she says that it's a personal matter and she knows him, it's really just jotted down as a message and he'll get back to you. It's not what she was looking for. She's going to have to think of another way to get to Harwood. But she also asks Katie to think about, and she's probably hungry, so she goes, grabs some food, and returns back to the house. As Katie and her are sitting down to eat, she starts mentioning that Katie doesn't fit the terrorist type, and Katie keeps saying, I'm not a terrorist. I've told you that. I'm an art student. But Bet just doesn't believe her. So she puts some art supplies in front of her and says, draw something. And Katie doesn't want to do it. She's just not in the mood. But Bet says, well, that's because you're going to get exposed. So that leaves Katie to pick up a pencil and start drawing. About 10 seconds later, though, she ends up throwing the art supplies in Bet's face and tries to run away, although she's quickly caught in the street. As they're arguing about why Katie just did that, and the reason is she tells Bet, "You're crazy," they get caught by 2 guards who tell them that they're not supposed to be there. And when the guards ask for their ID papers, Bet attacks them. She's doing a pretty good job of handling herself, but eventually one of the guards gets her on the ground and is choking her, and that's when Katie saves her life. Bet thanks Katie and then proceeds to go kill both guys, stabbing him in the neck. Katie starts puking at the scene, and Bet realizes that she might actually not be a terrorist. So she casually brings her back inside, and the two formulate a plan. In episode 3, all Alfie can think about is the money, but he should also consider the fact that the war is reached London. Bombs are getting dropped, windows are getting blown out, it's becoming a regular occurrence. He's actually woken up one morning by such an attack, goes downstairs to find his mother bandaging up a little girl. But he doesn't really think about it too much because he has to get to work. And as he's heading into the club, he runs into Martha Kane, but she acts like she doesn't know him. And he stops her and says, "What, you're just not going to talk to me?" And that is precisely what Martha was planning on doing. She yells at him because she thought he was an honorable man, and after the stunt he pulled with Salt, she no longer thinks that. She basically gives him the, "I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed" speech that my father gave me way too often. He tries to change the subject, saying how he saw Thomas Wayne at the club, and he was talking to Aleister Crowley, which he found weird. And Martha definitely finds that pretty bizarre. But as those two were talking outside, inside of the club, Boz and Dave Boy also can't get the fact that the money was stolen out of their head. That's when a guy named Ken the Spot walks up. And Ken is trying to sell a ring to anybody. He's one of these guys that always has something to sell and always seems to know what's going on in the neighborhood. So at first they yell at him because he knows that they don't have the money to buy a ring. But then they ask him, "What have you heard?" And he tells them nothing. "If I had heard something, I'd tell you." But Dave Boy doesn't really believe that, so he grabs the guy by his tie, pulling his head close to the table and putting a knife at his throat, demanding to know what he knows. And that's when Alfie walks in, putting a stop to it, because he doesn't believe that Ken actually does know. He sits down and tells them both that he had a really weird dream that featured his father, and the dream made him realize that the thief has got to be Gully Troy. He's the only other guy that knew that he had money. Knowing Gully, Dave Boy and Baza don't believe for a second that he would do it. But Alfie's pretty convinced that he did, and he figures he's got to get an answer, so he's just going to go find Gully and ask him himself. He heads over to Gully's place where he meets Mrs. Troy, someone he had no idea who existed. And flirtation is Mrs. Troy's superpower. I mean, she's dressed in a bathrobe, she's giving off some pretty heavy doomy vibes, and she tells Alfie, "I'm aware of you," but Alfie tells her, "Oh, I had no idea you existed. I really just came here to find out where Gully is." This dance goes on a little bit longer, but eventually she relinquishes the location of her husband. And Gully is in a warehouse with his team building themselves an armored car. Even though he was a captain in the army, he's kind of turned to a life of petty crime. But it's scaling upwards. Gully's excited to see Alfie, but that smile quickly evaporates when Alfie tells him the reason he's there. And Gully can't believe that he's being accused of this. Gully says, "Well, somebody in your inner circle is probably talking. I mean, I'm ruthless, but I'm not dishonorable." Now that it's settled that Gully didn't do it, the conversation turns a little bit more casual, with Gully offering Alfie a job. He wants Alfie to come and work for him. And while that is enticing because he has a really good relationship with Gully, he explains that he doesn't want to work for anybody, even one of his friends. Even if he knew it would be a good situation, he wants to be his own boss. He also doesn't want to get in a robbery, but Gully continues to push, saying that he'd hire Baza and Dave Boy because he's got these 2 big jobs coming up. But in the end, Alfie turns him down. Alfie heads home because he has to get ready for work that night, and his mom tells him that the girl that was on the couch earlier in the morning is going to make a full recovery. In fact, Mrs. Pennyworth actually saved the girl's life. Right as he's about to leave, his mom tells him, "I'm sorry you lost all your money, but I am glad you're not going to America." And Alfie looks at her and says, "Who said I'm not going to America?" And then he heads off to work. When he gets there, Dave Boy and Baza are at the bar. The club hasn't opened yet, and they're just having a drink before work. Alfie fills them in on the fact that Gully didn't do it, and as they're talking about who possibly could have, they all notice that Sherry, the girl behind the bar, who Dave Boy has been hitting on nonstop, is flashing a pretty nice-looking ring, a ring that looks an awful lot like the one that Ken was trying to peddle off on them earlier in the day. They ask her where she got it because they know that she can't afford it. They ask her who gave it to her, and she says a guy named Vic Dobson, which really flusters Dave Boy because he can't believe that she won't go out with him, but she'll go out with Vic Thompson of all people. But the bigger concern is the fact that they know that Vic doesn't have the money. And that's when Dave Boy admits that he got drunk one night and he was getting made fun of by a couple of guys. So he pulled out a $100 bill, slapped it on the table, and said, "There's more where that came from." He didn't know who he did that to, though, because he was drunk. But now they have a pretty good idea that the person must have been Vic. So at this point, opening up the club is the last thing on anybody's mind. They put Sherry in the car and they drive over to Vic's place. And Vic is living in a trailer located in what looks like an abandoned pop-up carnival. They're not really concerned about Vic since they know him. They don't really feel the need to get the lay of the land and all that. But Dave Boy and Baza spread out, and Alfie has Sherry yell Vic's name. It doesn't take more than about a minute for a firefight to break out between Baza, Dave Boy, and Vic's guys. Alfie decides to wait by Vic's car, and it ends up paying off because Vic tries to sneak out the back door with Alfie's money. And when he's spotted by Alfie, he runs into a house with mirrors. But Alfie's mean streak ends up coming out. He doesn't give a damn about the mirrors. He ends up pushing Vic through most of them. All that pent-up frustration about the fact that Vic kidnapped his mother and stole his money is flowing out of him, and he's kicking the crap out of Vic. But unfortunately for Alfie, he makes one step on some weak wood, and his leg goes through it, and he's kind of trapped. It gives Vic the opportunity to pull out his knife and head towards Alfie, but there was a reason why Alfie wasn't all that concerned with this guy. He's not a great fighter. And even though Alfie basically is a one-legged man at this point who's trapped, he's able to fight Vic off and stab him in the neck. Alfie, however, can't free himself from the floor. So with one hand grabbing the bag of money and the other hand trying to keep his neck from splurting out blood, Vic heads outside and tries to escape, and that's when Sherry sees him. Vic ends up dying in Sherry's arms, and by the time that Alfie ends up freeing himself and coming out, they notice that the bag of money is gone, and that's when they see Sherry speeding away. Baza runs into the street to try to stop her, but he doesn't end up firing a bullet, although it doesn't really matter. Sherry's not a good driver, ends up crashing into a bunch of oil barrels, and Baza's car goes up in flames. Sherry's dead, the money is burning, but when the vehicle exploded, it ended up tearing up Baza pretty good. The boys race to his aid, but his guts are literally hanging out of him. He's not going to make it. So it's a pretty emotional goodbye for the three friends, and they promise Baza that they will make it to America. Now, as I said, the war is raging on, and the bad news for the No Name League is the fact that Aleister Crowley's methods have worked. He was able to seduce the Archbishop, end up partaking in an orgy. Then he took pictures of it and sent it to the press. So there's the Archbishop all over the front page with a bunch of naked people, not a good look. He's going to be out of a job. The Archbishop, not being able to handle the disgrace, ends up committing suicide. This is going to be a problem for the league because they're once again looking for a prime minister. But as they're talking about who could replace him, they're also talking about how ridiculous all of this is. It doesn't make any sense. They know the Archbishop. They know he's not that kind of guy. And that's when the Queen brings up that Aleister Crowley must have gotten to him. That name really piques interest with Martha, and it suddenly hits her. This must have had something to do with Thomas Wayne. There's no other reason why Wayne would even want to link back up with Aleister. So to get some answers, Martha heads over to Thomas's office and questions him about it. And while he feels gross and he wants to explain himself, the only words he can muster are, "Nobody wanted him dead." And that's when a disgusted Martha Kane slaps Thomas in the face and walks out. But what's going on with the Archbishop is great news for the Raven Union. After Salt, Gaunt, and Harwood have a good laugh about it, Gaunt mentions to Harwood that he's looking run down. He probably needs a break. But he tells her, "I can't. We got a war going on." As he's looking over some documents for Salt, his secretary walks in and lets him know that somebody is on the line who's been calling nonstop looking for him. Her name is Bette Sykes. Francis, Gaunt, and even Salt beg him not to take that phone call. They know that Bette Sykes is unstable and not good for business. But Harwood, who feels a connection with Sykes and also feels indebted to her, tells his secretary to put the call through. Bette and Katie ended up at the house of one of Katie's old art teachers. You can tell that Katie really admired this guy, but that doesn't really matter to Bette. She comes in hot, aggressive, and rude. After explaining it's at the house where she made the phone call. After getting some pleasantries out the way, she ends up telling Harwood about the fact that she killed a superior officer and he wants him to kind of fix it. Like a puppy who just pissed on the carpet, Harwood admonishes her, but it's more of a, this can't happen again. And then he tells her that he's going to send a car to pick her up and bring her back. For that, he gives the location to Salt, telling him to send a car with his best men to pick up Bet Sykes. But nobody thinks this is a good idea except Harwood. Both Francis and Salt try to convince him otherwise, but he ends up yelling at him that he's the boss. He doesn't need their opinion. When Bet gets off the phone, she heads in the living room where she's found Katie and her teacher clearly talking about Bet. They deny it, but they were. It's not like the teacher hasn't noticed that Katie and Bet really don't mix. And even after Katie explains to her teacher that Bet saved her life and she feels like they could be friends, the teacher's just worried for his former pupil. But Katie's only gotten a glimpse of Bet Sykes' short temper. And there's one thing that Bet can't get over. She doesn't believe that Katie is an art student. Even though they're sitting in the house of Katie's former teacher, who is clearly an artist, he's got paintings and drawings all over his house. Bet demands that Katie start drawing something. So Katie does. But that's when the cops show up. The teacher runs outside to yell for help, but he gets shot up. And then those, quote, police turn their attention to the house, lighting it up with bullets. Katie and Bet are able to barely escape out the back door and get away. In episode 4, they lay to rest Baza. At the funeral, Gully shows up, but Alfie knows that he's not just paying his respects. Gully's always hated funerals, and he's never been one to take no for an answer. So he knows that Gully's just there to try to get employees for this job. And while Alfie doesn't want to rob anybody, he also knows that he has no money and he's down a guy. So he's in between a rock and a hard place, and he agrees to work for Gully this one time. The next night, he wakes up in the middle of the night and heads to do this job. And the job is to get the mayor's vehicle stopped so they can ambush it. But when they go inside, there's no money. There's no gold. There's nothing. Gully starts asking the mayor where it is, but then Alfie takes over, beating the crap out of the mayor and really showing a mean streak that we haven't seen before. But it's a lot of pent-up frustration from the last few days. Even though Dave Boy and Gully tell him to chill out because the guy can't tell him where the gold is if he's dead, this beating does elicit an admission of where they can find it. To celebrate, everybody then heads to Alfie's club and they start popping bottles of champagne. One of those people is Mrs. Troy, and she's still giving those F me eyes to Alfie. But one of Gully's usual guys starts openly talking about the fact that they got this money from robbing somebody. And that doesn't sit well with Alfie because he doesn't want anybody knowing about it. He's kind of ashamed of the fact that he had to resort to this. But that really insults Gully's crew because it makes it look like Alfie thinks he's better than him. It starts a little bit of a fight, and Mrs. Troy gets sick of watching it, so she gets up to leave, but Gully says no. You leave when I say you can leave. And she tells him to go F himself, to which he responds by backslapping the crap out of her. He goes to do it again, but Alfie stops him and tells him, you don't do that here. If you want to beat your wife, you do it at your place. Gully and Alfie then have a chat privately. At first, it's a big pissing contest. The pissing contest leads to both of them holding each other at knife point. But when cooler heads prevail, Alfie tells Gully, that's it, I'm done. I don't really like this lifestyle. It doesn't really agree with me. But Gully has one more final job. It's a big one. He needs Alfie. He needs him by his side. So he asks him to come back, and Alfie tells him, I'll think about it. Alfie then heads downstairs and tells the barkeeper to call last round. And as he's hanging out by himself, Mrs. Troy walks up to him. She tells Alfie, tell Gully that I'll be waiting for him outside. And then she thanks him for stepping in. And Alfie's response to that is to aggressively make out with her. She absolutely 1000% kisses him back, but she also stops herself, slaps Alfie, and tells him, I'm not sure if you're brave or stupid. And he tells her, both. Now, the war is still raging on, but it hasn't been the rousing success that Harwood would have liked. They've been trying to make inroads, but it hasn't really bared fruit. One thing they could do is artillery strikes on London, because if London falls, then all of it falls, but what's the point of destroying a city if you actually want to take it? And there is one way that they don't have to destroy the city, but they also could win the war, and that's Stormcloud. But Francis Gaunt says, I'm not having that. And Harwood reminds her that she's not in charge. This results in him screaming at Francis, kicking her out of the room. And with just him and Salt, it gives Harwood a little bit of time to decompress. And he does ask Salt, what's the latest with Bet Sykes? But Salt lies to him and tells him she disappeared. We're trying to find her. In reality, he tried to kill her. But Bet Sykes is alive and well. She's made it to London hitching a ride, and now she just has to find her sister. And the thing is, she's not worried one bit that she's in league territory. Katie, on the other hand, is thrilled to be back because in league territory she feels comfortable. But neither of them feel great when they go to the address of Peggy Sykes and it's all boarded up, looks abandoned, and they don't really know what to do. With nowhere else to go, they end up sleeping on the street that night. The next day when they wake up, Katie suggests that they split up looking for Peggy. But all Bet heard was split up. She feels like she has to protect Katie, but Katie reminds her, we're in league territory, I'm fine. And that's when Bet reminds her that being in league territory doesn't mean that she's safe. But Katie says, I know that, but what use to you am I? And Bet yells at her, what about moral support? I mean, I thought we were friends. And when Katie says, yeah, no, we are, I mean, kind of, Bet takes true offense to it. But these two women have been traveling alone for a little bit now. And one of the reasons why Katie said kind of is because Bet won't open up. She won't talk about her past. And when Katie prods again, Bet just walks away. She heads to a phone booth, but right behind her is Katie, following her with that moral support. And as luck would have it, they find out where Peggy is. She's running her own sex shop. So finally, Bet is able to link back up with Peggy, and the two sisters are back together. And then finally, there's Thomas Wayne, who goes to visit Martha Kane. He knows that Martha doesn't want to talk to him, but he's in a dilemma. He's got a party to attend to for his sister, and his sister has found a new boyfriend that he hates. He's a fashion designer who has a very checkered past, like sleeping with 13-year-olds checkered past. So Thomas tells Martha this entire backstory of why he needs her, but it turns out Martha's already headed to the party. Patricia invited her. And right before Martha leaves her apartment, she tells Thomas, Patricia's going to be the only Wayne I'll be talking to. Although that's a complete lie. When Thomas finally shows up at this party, Martha is already talking to Patricia and her new guy, Jacques. The four of them start making casual conversation, but Jacques is putting down Martha and her fashion sense. He even goes so far as to give Martha his card saying, I can help you out, you got to give me a call. And when Jacques and Patricia finally walk away, Martha ends up talking to Thomas and telling him, yeah, you're right, that guy sucks. They think this is one of Patricia's normal boyfriends that she'll be done with in a little bit, but then they look over the dance floor, and Jacques has proposed to Patricia. So now the group needs to formulate a plan to get rid of this guy, and the plan they come up with is to have Martha call Jacques up and say, you're right, I do need your help. But when he gets over there, she's going to try to seduce him, and then Thomas is going to come over with Patricia. Patricia's going to see her guy with Martha. She's going to know that he's not loyal, and then she's going to dump him. So in order to kill time after the party, Thomas and Patricia head to the club. Martha ends up calling Jacques up, and it's working great. I mean, Jacques ends up stripping down to nothing. The problem is, Thomas and Patricia are taking forever to come back from the club. But when they finally walk into the apartment, there's Martha, fine, and then there's Jacques, tied up naked on the ground, and that's when Patricia knows that her guy isn't really loyal. She ends up chasing him down the streets of London, naked, screaming at him about what a scumbag he is. That leaves Martha and Thomas to celebrate their win, but all the bad blood that was built up over what happened to the Archbishop is seemingly gone, because the excitement of that night ends up leading to the excitement in the bedroom. Thomas Wayne and Martha Kane finally hook up. But while all of that was going on, the Raven Union is hard at work to try to win this war. Francis Gaunt has got information that the League has elected a new prime minister, and it's Aziz. And that name definitely is familiar to Harwood because he remembers Aziz being the one to torture him back in the tower. Harwood then apologized to Francis for how he acted, and Francis accepts the apology because she knows that he's in a fragile state. Health-wise, he's doing horribly. She tells him, if you were a sailor, I'd say you have scurvy. You really got to take care of yourself. The conversation then segues into Stormcloud, and Harwood tells her, look, that is a last resort. But Harwood at this point doesn't know what to do because the League isn't giving in, even though they've basically lost. And Francis suggests that maybe Aziz being the prime minister could help them. Maybe they could do business with him. But doing business with Aziz is something that Harwood has zero interest in. He then mentions how he wishes Bet and Peggy were there because they always cheer him up, and then he starts getting a little disoriented. He completely forgets about what they were even talking about. It's like Francis Gaunt was having a conversation with two different people. She leaves the room and runs an assault. And it's ironic that he walks up to her after this just happened because he's been concerned about Harwood's state of mind for a while now. But even after what she just saw, she comes to his defense, saying that Salt is dangerously close to being disloyal. So Salt gently approaches Frances with the same thing that she just told Harwood. Go to Aziz. Maybe through an intermediary, he might listen to reason. But Aziz is already hard at work at trying to win this war. He's been able to put a spy in the Raven Union, and that spy goes to look at a display of storm cloud. He opens up a curtain, and there's a bunch of guys walking around in a square, and when he presses a button, a cloud rushes over the square, completely covering them. They have no idea what happened until suddenly one of the individuals smashes up against the glass, and they're clearly dying a painful death. Salt tells the group that within 5 minutes, that square could be clear, and it'll be safe enough for children to play in. Aziz's spy is mortified, but Harwood, he's so impressed that he stands up and gives it a standing ovation. Because the way he looks at it, this is going to win him the war. In episode 5, Alfie has a meeting with Thomas Wayne to see about getting out of the country and getting to the States, but Thomas tells him that's not going to be easy to do. With the war raging on, everybody wants to get out, and the price is skyrocketed. It's literally double of what Alfie thought he was going to have to pay to get out, which means that Alfie's going to need more money. After the meeting, Thomas heads back to Martha's place and logs his interaction with Alfie, where he tells his superiors that Alfie's a long-standing asset target. His taped rundown gets interrupted when Martha comes downstairs, and their relationship is going great. They've had sex exactly 4 times. But with all that premarital intercourse is coming some feelings, and Thomas is getting a little bit concerned about Martha's goings-on with the League. Martha gives him I'm a big girl. I can take care of myself. She then has to get going because she has a meeting to facilitate between Francis Gaunt and Aziz. It's a secret meeting, but it could go a long way with stopping the war. After making the initial introduction and a few pleasantries get out the way, it becomes clear to both Francis and Aziz that there's no real ground to be made here. Francis thinks it's ridiculous when Aziz says that he hasn't even thought about surrendering. And Aziz actually pitches to Francis that the League is winning this thing. Maybe not territorially, but they're winning hearts and minds. In the end, though, they're getting absolutely nowhere. And to make matters worse for Francis, turns out Salt is a complete rat. He pitched Francis the idea of going to Aziz, and after she agreed to do so because he had no idea that it was actually her idea in the first place, he rats her out to Harwood. Harwood plays it off like he knew the whole time, and he was actually the one to tell Francis to go meet with him, but it really pisses him off. And when Francis returns, he confronts her about it, and then he has her thrown in jail because he has no interest whatsoever in doing business with Aziz. Not after what Aziz did to him back in the tower. He really feels heartbroken about Francis's betrayal. So you can only imagine what he would do if he found out that there was a spy in the building, which there still is. Thought it was Aziz, but it turns out, no, it was Thomas Wayne's. He's able to hack the phone lines and send Thomas a message on what's basically an early version of a fax machine. And the message is, need out ASAP. But Thomas was asleep when the message came in, and he doesn't see it until late at night, when it might be too late. Now, after the meeting he had with Thomas, Alfie headed back over to the club. He meets up with Dave Boy and explains to him how expensive it's going to be to get both of them, including his mother, over to the States. And Dave Boy proposes that they go back and they work for Gully. This big job that Gully's proposing, it could get them enough money to get over the pond. As they're having this discussion, Sandra and her dad walk up, and Sandra has great news. She got a record deal. She's so excited, but she wants Alfie to come. And Alfie gives her his normal response, I'll try, which is becoming an awful trend. As Alfie puts it, I do always try. The problem is he never makes it. And Sandra tries to plead with him that she sings better when she feels safe, and she feels safest when she's with Alfie. But after Sandra and her dad leave, it's become clear to Dave Boy that Alfie still hasn't told Sandra about his plans to go over to the States. And Alfie has been putting it off, but as he tells Dave Boy, we don't have enough money to go over to the States now anyway, so I'll tell her when we get the cash. But they could possibly get the money that night with Gully's job. Alfie calls up Gully to meet with him, and they go over the lay of the land of the target. The target is going to be a wrestling show. After Alfie says that he's in, Gully tells him to meet him at his house to go over the details of everything with the whole gang. And that's going to be a little bit uncomfortable for Alfie considering he did make out with Gully's wife, but he's going to have to suck it up because they have a job to do. So later that day, Alfie and Dave Boy head over to Gully's, and the first person Alfie sees is Mrs. Gully. She's a little bit surprised to see him because, as she says, I thought you'd have more respect. Alfie thinks that she's talking about him kissing her, but she's actually talking about the job they're about to do. He then heads into the living room, and Gully's going over the details of the plan. They're going to rob the wrestling event during the main event. It's going to be 25 minutes, and since wrestling is scripted, it'll give them the opportunity to get in and get out undetected because the main event always goes the longest. It's the last-ditch effort for these places to make some money on food and beer and whatnot. So they sneak in while all eyes are on the ring, blow open the safe, grab the money, and then get out. Easy as that. That night, the group heads over to the wrestling arena. They sneak in, and everything's going according to plan. The main event's kicking off, and they make their way to the office where they break in. Apparently, this is kind of commonplace, and it doesn't usually end well for the robbers, but the robbers usually aren't Gully's crew. As Gully is working on rigging the safe for explosion, Alfie is busy looking at the time, making sure that they have enough of it. The problem is the match isn't going according to plan. The two women in the main event are actually getting into a real fight. It results in the match ending early, and that was not according to plan. Right after the ring announcer announces that the main event is done and that's it for the evening, Gully blows the safe, which puts everybody into a panic. The foot traffic starts trying to run for the exits, and that's on the lookouts to make sure that they don't get through the door, but that's nearly impossible with the amount of people. With this plan being pretty botched, Alfie wants to get going, but when Gully shows him how much money's in the safe, Alfie changes his mind and starts loading the bags up. But as Gully and his crew start making their way out, they see the other two members that were supposed to be the lookouts running towards them, and they know that something's going wrong. Alfie's got a pretty big bag, and he gets lost from everybody else, and he goes down one hallway, and he's face-to-face with one of the female wrestlers, who's not about to let him leave. Alfie pulls a gun on her, but he doesn't want to shoot her, and that's when all of a sudden she gets shot in the head by one of Gully's guys, and it's the same guy that's always getting into it with Dave Boy and Alfie. Alfie's pretty shook by this, but he also knows he needs to get the hell out of there. When they eventually get back to the warehouse that Gully works out of, most of the crew is celebrating, but not Alfie and not Dave Boy. Alfie's taking his money, but he's also making it known that he's not happy about how that went down. And the guy who fired the shot says, "Calm down, like you haven't killed somebody before." But Alfie tells him, "I have, but it's never been in a panic, and it certainly hasn't been with my mask down." And that's when Gully tells everybody to quiet down. Things happen, you move on. But Alfie's not willing to be quiet. The two kind of start to get into it, but Dave Boy, of all people, gets in the middle and tells Alfie, "Come on, dude, let's get going. Let's go back and have a drink." He ends up going home that morning, running into his mother, and the robbery and subsequent murder at the wrestling match is the front page of the paper. Alfie doesn't know any of this, so when he comes in and he says that he squared away the money and everything's good, his mother's worried that he did so robbing the wrestling match. And he's a terrible liar when it comes to his mother, so she realizes that, oh my God, my son actually did do it. He tries to explain himself, but his mother slaps him and tries to kick him out, saying, "I don't want to hear from you, and for the last time, I'm not going to America. I'd never go there with a murderous robber like you." So with nowhere else to go, Alfie just heads to the club. He completely forgets about the fact that that night is Sandra's recording session. He skips it. And not only does he skip it, but as he's peering out over the club, he sees one person sitting by themselves, and it's Mrs. Gully. He heads down to find out why she's there, and it's probably to hurt her husband, because Gully constantly belittles her, and he gets abusive. And it's not like Alfie is Gully's biggest fan at the moment. So he escorts Mrs. Gully up to his office, and the two hook up. Where's Gully in all of this, you ask? Well, it wasn't like what happened at the wrestling match was lost on him. So he takes that problem employee out to the woods and shoots him in the head execution style. And then finally there's Bet Sykes, Katie, and Peggy. They're all working at the sex shop. And while there, a customer comes in, but Bet recognizes him from the tower. So she's not willing to let this guy leave. She ties him up and starts interrogating him, and Katie is mortified. She's begging Bet to let him go. She's begging Peggy to tell Bet to let him go, but Peggy says, "No, I can't. She's not wrong. If we let him go, Bet's going to be back in the tower getting ready to be hanged." And all of this is news to Katie. Bet is so angry that Peggy is telling her business that she ends up leaving. And after she leaves, Peggy tells Katie everything. The backstory of Bet Sykes is the fact that they had a younger sister that Bet loved. But the younger sister died from drowning after Bet pushed her in the water. Bet was always blamed for it, but she didn't mean to do it. It wasn't on purpose. But ever since then, it's like bad luck just kind of finds Bet. And then she points to the guy in the chair and says, like this guy. In the tower, he raped her. Bet tries to be good, but she's done some pretty bad things. Even after hearing all of this, Katie goes, finds Bet, and tells her that she's not leaving. She's going to stand by her side. And the two women head back to Peggy's that night, And they also hook
In
up. This is a
episode
big
6,
hookup episode.
Alfie
If you haven't
wakes up in
noticed,
bed next
everybody's
to
banging.
Melanie Troy, and he had fun. Seems like she had fun. But it's all it is a fling. At least to Alfie. She might be more attracted to Alfie and have feelings for him, but he's planning on going to America, so he's not getting attached to anything. In fact, when he gets out of bed, the first place he heads is to Thomas Wayne's office and slaps down the money that's required to get him and 2 other people to America. The plan is to leave for America that Friday. Thomas is pretty surprised that Alfie was able to come up with this amount of money this quickly. He actually had a job lined up for him, but he tells Alfie, yeah, I guess you don't really need it. And Alfie does not take the bait. In fact, he tells Thomas, I'm never coming to work for you. And then he heads to the club. After Alfie leaves, Thomas Wayne had a meeting with the new Prime Minister, Aziz. Aziz isn't alone, though. Martha Kane is there as well, and it's a little bit awkward. Their relationship is so frenetic. The reason why Thomas Wayne showed up, though, is because he needs help getting that agent out of the Raven Union. He figures that they can just set it up to look like a kidnapping, but the fact that this scientist was working on Stormcloud could really benefit them. The fact is, though, nobody really knows what Stormcloud is, which is the whole reason of why they need to pull this scientist out as soon as possible. There is one issue that Aziz points to, the fact that the CIA is backing the competition. And Thomas Wayne just tells him that the CIA backs winners, and the League's loss is a foregone conclusion at this point. Thomas tells him, if we can't do something for the League, then what can we do for you, personally? And Aziz does actually have something. He knows that Thomas Wayne is close to Aleister Crowley, even though Thomas Wayne doesn't think they are. At the very least, Thomas Wayne knows how to get in touch with him, knows how to bend his ear, and he wants to get a message to Crowley that John Ripper plans to abduct and murder him. That seems pretty easy for Thomas, so he says consider it done. He then goes into more details about the scientist, the fact that he'll have a couple bodyguards, and that Aziz should consider some really good guys on this job, one of them being Alfred Pennyworth. And Aziz is pretty sure that he'll be able to convince Alfie to do the job. Once Thomas leaves, Martha Kane wants to know what the hell Aziz is thinking. She starts to question him, but then all of a sudden she gets sick to her stomach, and she has to run to the bathroom and puke because she is clearly pregnant. By the time she comes back, she asks, why are we telling Aleister Crowley that he's going to be abducted and murdered? And Aziz says, I thought that was pretty obvious. Ripper wants my job, and I don't want him to have it. Martha Kane eventually leaves. And as Aziz is sitting there, he's trying to think of what he's going to do about this John Ripper situation. Just tipping off Aleister Crowley isn't going to be enough. That's when he gets the idea to send Ripper a message. He traps a fly, tapes it to a pentagram, and just makes it look like something creepy. And he sends it to Ripper, and Ripper thinks that it's from Crowley. So as if John Ripper wasn't already going after Aleister Crowley, now he's really going after him. Meanwhile, Thomas Wayne did his side of the job. He tips off Aleister Crowley, so Aleister Crowley knows to be on the lookout for John Ripper. He prepares for this by putting on some kind of lipstick, drinking some kind of antidote, taking his dog out for a walk, so when Ripper does finally pick him up, he's not all that worried. He kisses John Ripper on the cheek, and then John Ripper starts threatening him, but then all of a sudden, John Ripper just freezes. Crowley stabs Ripper's driver, gets in the front seat, and starts driving him around. While the John Ripper situation was being taken care of, Alfie had to take care of a tough conversation with Sandra. He's finally mustered the guts to tell Sandra that he's going to America and she's not coming with him. So because of that, he's got to end things. She doesn't take it well. She definitely doesn't take it well when he tries to pay her off. It's a very awkward breakup. As Alfie is sitting in the club, going over some books, getting ready for that day, all of a sudden, a bunch of guards come in, secure the place, and that's when Aziz and the Queen show up. This is the first time that Alfie has seen the Queen since they did Adult Fun, and she's not too happy with Alfie for ghosting her. It's also awkward for Alfie because he thought he'd never have to see her again, which is stupid on his part because the Queen is a dime. Well, both Aziz and the Queen sit Alfie down and try to convince him to do this job regarding the scientist. At first, Alfie pushes back, and that's when they let Alfie know that they have some dirt on him. They know that he's sleeping with Gully's wife. He tries to play it off like he's not, but it's a poorly kept secret. He knows that he can't risk this information getting back to Gully, so he has to do the job. Once the Queen and Aziz leave, the first thing he does isn't call Dave Boy. He calls up Melanie Troy. He asks her if Gully's acting weird, and she tells him no. He warns her that she needs to get out of there before he finds out, but it seems like she's gonna stay. The next thing he does is go wake up Dave Boy. Alfie tells Dave Boy they have to do one more job for Aziz, and Dave Boy knows that something's up. He starts asking Alfie why they're doing this job, what Aziz had on him, and Alfie doesn't want to come clean. All he wants to tell Dave Boy is it's because of a woman. And right away, Dave Boy knows that it's Melanie Troy. Dave Boy tells him half the club knows, and I can tell you, she's got trouble written all across her forehead in red paint. He then starts giving it to Alfie about how stupid it is to get involved with the wife of Gully Troy because they know what Gully used to do to prisoners. What would Gully do if he found out somebody was having sex with his wife? Deep down, Alfie knows he's right. But at the moment, all he wants to do is get this job done and over with. They're going to have some company, by the way. Martha Kane is coming with them. They know that the scientist is going to be at a diner, so they head there and just pretend to be patrons. Martha tries to make mention of Baza dying, but neither guy really wants to talk about it. And that's when the scientist comes in with 2 guards. Martha goes over to feel the group out, and they're not too friendly. And that's when Alfie and Dave Boy go over. Alfie sits down, and he could recognize that the one guard must be ex-military, so he starts trying to reason with him, because deep down, Alfie doesn't want to have to shoot anybody or kill anybody. He just wants to take the scientist and get out of there. But this guard is super hard-headed, and it results in a shootout where Dave Boy gets shot because, of course he gets shot. He gets shot in just about every episode, but he's fine. It's just a flesh wound. And the group ends up getting the scientist and getting out of there with a bunch of dead bodies left in this diner. When they get him in the car, it turns out that this scientist, Professor Fox, is pretty rude. He's also pretty frazzled, so they just take him over to Thomas Wayne's office right away. And the sexual tension between Thomas and Martha can be seen in neon. So much so that when Professor Fox gets Thomas alone, he makes mention of the fact that they must have been former lovers. It's kind of uncomfortable, so Thomas gets the topic back on track, which is storm cloud. Fox tells him that it's worse than projected. It could kill the entire population of London with a device the size of a cigarette lighter. The worst part is, it's going to be ready next week. Fox then sounds a lot like Martha Kane. He tells Thomas Wayne that the president needs to step in. He needs to warn Harwood that if he deploys Stormcloud, he's going to end up getting squashed by America. But Thomas toes the company line, saying that what Fox is talking about is worst case scenario, and for the moment, all they can do is pass along the intel. They supply the data, Washington makes the decision, and while Thomas tells Fox that he's confident Washington will do the right thing, Fox doesn't agree with that assessment. He doesn't think they're doing enough. Fox tells him that if the CIA won't act, then he'll do something. And when Thomas says, well, what are you going to do? Fox shoots back, you're the CIA station chief. What are you going to do? And the word of Fox getting kidnapped and abducted has gotten back to Harwood. Salt fills him in on the fact that they know it was Pennyworth, and Harwood mentions how Pennyworth is becoming a thorn in his side. But Salt then mentions a bigger issue, at least in his opinion. He was approached earlier in the day by a lieutenant who is adamant that Frances Gaunt is innocent. And the lieutenant came there to get Salt's help in freeing her, not realizing that Salt was the person who really put her behind bars in the first place. So this lieutenant asked Salt, go to Harwood, talk to him. He listens to you. But instead of doing that, Salt continued to be a rat. He takes Harwood aside and tells him that Gaunt still has friends among them. These friends are pushing to have her pardoned and brought back to power. He knows that Harwood's going to look at these people as traitors, but Salt acts like he doesn't know who they are, he's just hearing whispers. So his suggestion to Harwood is that these people will reveal themselves. Gaunt can't be saved without Harwood, so these traitors are going to have to come to him. And when they do, no matter who they are or how trustworthy they seem, they've just revealed themselves as a traitor and you take care of them. Salt knows the whole time that this lieutenant is going to go to Harwood, and sure enough, he does. He asks Harwood the same thing he asked Salt, to look into Frances Gaunt, but that's when Harwood snaps, beating the crap out of this poor kid and murdering him in front of all of these witnesses. But this kid was really well respected, and this is one mistake too many for Harwood. People have noticed that he's kind of been fraying a little bit, and this is the straw that breaks the camel's back. They arrest him, and with no Frances Gaunt, the second in command was Salt, which means now with no Harwood, Salt is in full command of the Raven Union. Salt was the only one manipulating his bosses, though. Aziz was kind of doing the same thing with John Ripper, who reappears in the League's offices, and he is going through something. Whatever Aleister Crowley gave him, it's like he's in another world. But to the outside, he looks like he's just going through a nervous breakdown. Right before Ripper's taken away, Aziz makes sure to tell him, "It was me that did this to you." And then finally, over in the neutral zone, Alfie and Dave Boy get back to the club, and they're fighting about how that entire kidnapping went down. That's when Alfie's approached by Sandra's father. He gives Alfie the business, then punches him in the face. In a shocking twist, Dave Boy kind of sides with Sandra's dad. Alfie's sick of all of it, and he quickly finds himself at the bar alone. But he's not alone for long, because his mom watched all of that. She approaches her son for the first time since she kicked him out of the house. He apologizes for everything that he's recently put her through. And she knows her son's sorry, but she also knows that trouble has a way of finding him. Can't look after him if he's thousands of miles away. So she agrees to go to America with Alfie. On 3 conditions. No guns, no violence, and Alfie will give her a grandchild. And Alfie agrees. In episode 7, Harwood is thrown into prison, but in reality, he's just under lock and key. He's back at his estate, and he's trying to figure out how he's going to get back into power. Meanwhile, over at Raven HQ, Salt is doing his work. There's a general that wants Salt to put Harwood on trial for murder, but Salt doesn't want to do that, saying that they currently need Harwood to smile for the cameras. Nobody needs to know that he's under lock and key. And if, God forbid, they drop Stormcloud, it would be done in Harwood's name, because then Harwood could be the scapegoat for it. But the secretary that takes Harwood's calls can't just stand by and let his name be sullied. She needs help, and the only person she knows that Harwood trusts that currently isn't locked up are the Sykes sisters, so she calls them up. They head over to Harwood's estate, basically bust their way in. He's thrilled to see them, but he's not going with them. He knows that Salt has won. He tells them that the army's never going to trust him again after what he did. Salt planned all of this. He made himself indispensable to me, and he's done the same thing with the Army and the Union. And now he's ruling in my name, and no one's going to touch him. Harwood mentions that the best way to stop Salt is for him to die. Because with him dead, Salt won't be able to rule in his name. Without that leverage, Salt will never last long. But the idea of Harwood dying isn't exactly on the Sykes sisters' minds. They want to come up with an alternative solution. Right as they're about to leave, they hear somebody on a bullhorn tell them that the house is surrounded. They can't escape. The Sykes sisters getting in there made quite a bit of ruckus. Army soldiers come into the house, but Harwood stops them and says, "Wait, you, I don't trust you guys, but I also don't want any more bloodshed. I'll surrender tomorrow, but I'll only do it to Colonel Salt." And Salt really doesn't want to do it, but he also doesn't want to have the situation escalate, so he's going to be forced to go. The next day, the army shows up, Salt shows up, and Harwood's plan is to create a diversion at the front of the house, which is going to let the Sykes sisters sneak out the back door. Once they're in the clear, they need to get a message to Francis Gaunt. Apologize for Harwood. The Sykes sisters are concerned about what's going to happen to Harwood, but he looks at him and says, "Just trust me on this. Trust that I'll do the right thing." So the plan goes into action. Harwood goes out the front. The Sykes sisters sneak out the back. But the diversion that Harwood creates is yelling about how Salt is a traitor. He tries to get the soldiers on his side, but it doesn't work. Nobody follows him. He then pulls out a gun, and Salt gets super nervous that the soldiers are going to do something. He can't risk Harwood being harmed, and Harwood knows that. So Harwood steps forward with this gun, and he basically forces the soldiers to shoot him, murdering him. And now Salt's in deep trouble, because without Harwood, the Raven Union leadership is going to go to an election. Now over with the opposition, they were worried about Stormcloud, and Washington has an answer for them. They tell both Fox and Thomas Wayne to stand down, do nothing. That's what the U.S. government's planning on doing. They're out of sight, out of mind. It's not their problem. And both Wayne and Fox are blown away that the U.S. government is just going to sit back and watch the Raven Union drop a literal terror bomb on a city. And that's when they realize that the U.S. government wants the Raven Union to use Stormcloud. They just want culpable deniability. And they want it used because they want the war over. They don't care how it happens. They just want it done. Wayne's boss tells them that both of them are to be on the embassy flight the next day. But as Fox is ready to tell her what's on his mind, Thomas shuts the TV off. He knows it's not going to do any good. At this point, you're just going to piss them off. You're not going to change their mind. But Thomas also isn't willing to sit back and do nothing like his government. So he calls up Martha Wayne and schedules a meeting to discuss something, quote, important.
And of course, she has something to discuss with him that's pretty important. So they agree to meet that night at her place. Fortunately, they go to the club, they get drunk, and they show up way late. Like 1:35 in the morning late. A drunk Thomas Wayne tells Martha, "You have to get out of here right now." They quickly explain to her what Stormcloud is and the fact that they're going to use it on London in about a week. And the worst part is the U.S. government's going to look the other way. Thomas is hoping that she'll go to Aziz. Of course she's going to, because he knows that the best way to stop Stormcloud is public exposure. If Aziz yells loud enough, then the U.S. government can't ignore him. President will have to intervene. But it's important that Martha not tell Aziz who gave her this information, even though Aziz is going to know who gave her this information. If it ever sees the light of day, Thomas is just going to deny that he ever said anything. Patricia then walks downstairs because she's staying with Martha. She's surprised to see her brother there, and he explains that there's soon going to be a chemical attack on London. They're booked on a government flight leaving that day, and they have to be on it, no ifs, ands, or buts. Martha is dead set. She is not getting on that plane. She still believes that they can stop Stormcloud, but they still have quite a bit of time before this plane leaves to hash out those kind of details. Now, over with Alfie, he's been staying at the club. He shows up, and there's Melanie Troy. She tells him that her husband knows nothing about their relationship. There's absolutely nothing to worry about. But when he heads home later that day to help his mom pack up some stuff and sell some other stuff, he's pretty surprised when Gully walks through the door. Alfie gets extremely nervous. He doesn't know why Gully's there, and he's suspicious when Gully tells him he's there because of a job. He doesn't like how they ended the last job, and this job pays really well, but he sees that Alfie's packing up to leave. He's a little surprised. He never thought Alfie would actually leave London, but yet here he is. And not only is he leaving London, but he's saying no to the job. Gully is definitely suspicious. He finally puts everything together and he confronts his wife about what is going on, and it leads to a domestic dispute where she ends up getting away by stabbing him in the throat. It doesn't kill him. In fact, he's able to stitch himself up, but she doesn't know that. She's only got one place to go, and that's the club and Alfie's office. When Melanie mentions how she's not going to be safe anywhere, Alfie tells her, "Then you need to come to America with me." So the next day, when it comes time for Alfie, his mom, Dave Boy to leave, Melanie's in the car with him. But when it comes time for everybody to get on the plane, Alfie can't bring himself to do it. His mother is thrilled, Dave Boy's kind of pissed, and Melanie's the only one left standing there. And Alfie tells her, "I can't go, but you can. You need to get on that plane. Get away from Gully." When Melanie asks him why he changed his mind, he says, "Well, it sounds stupid, but this is my home, and it's worth fighting for." The two say their goodbyes. Melanie tells him that if he's ever in Gotham to look her up, and then they go their separate ways. But it's not like Melanie's going to be alone on this plane ride. She makes a friend in Patricia Wayne. And as Alfie is watching the plane take off, Thomas comes up and approaches him. He's shocked because all Alfie's been talking about is getting to America. He paid a lot of money for those tickets, and now he's not even using them. Alfie tells him he changed his mind. And then Alfie realizes that Thomas is supposed to be on that plane too. And when he asks Thomas, "Why aren't you on there?" Thomas says, "I've changed my mind." They then walk off, and Alfie and Thomas meet up with Martha, Dr. Fox, and they head over to show Aziz the film of exactly what Stormcloud can do. Thomas fills Aziz in on what the U.S.'s standing is. Thomas tells Aziz, "You have to show this to the U.S. president publicly. With this evidence, she can't just sit back and do nothing." The League then gets ready to make their next move. Both the Raven Union and for Lord Harwood, who was pretty well respected. With Salt now in charge for the time being, he calls a meeting with Aziz to discuss peace talks. He needs some backup, so he has Alfie come with him. Alfie's forced to leave his mom at home, and he's worried that Gully is going to come after him, so he has Dave Boy watch by her side and make sure that nobody breaks in and does anything to her. Aziz is more than happy to talk about peace, and as a sign of good faith, he's going to allow Lord Harwood's funeral party to enter the city and be buried in his family crypt. After that, they'll talk about peace. The Queen will be in attendance, as will most other high-ranking officials from the League. Most people in the League are thrilled that Lord Harwood is dead, but Thomas Wayne doesn't think that's really a good thing. The thing is, the League doesn't really know enough about Salt to have a judgment on him. But after Aziz talked to both Salt and the Colonel for the Army together, he thinks that there's tension there. Aziz also doesn't think that they're going to use Stormcloud. He looked at Harwood as crazy, but Salt as a normal-minded individual. So the League is feeling pretty good. After the post-meeting, Alfie heads home to find a drunk Dave Boy, and he's pissed. He calls him irresponsible, and Dave Boy shoots back, "Oh, I'm irresponsible." He then starts pointing out all of the things that led them to this point, and it's really Alfie who's the irresponsible one. Even Alfie has to concede this fact. Alfie's mom comes downstairs, and she agrees with Dave Boy. She tells Alfie, if your father was alive right now, he'd be rolling over in his grave thinking about you committing adultery. So now I have to deal with that, and I have to deal with terror bombs. And Alfie gets pretty pissed off at Dave Boy for telling his mother about Stormcloud, but Mrs. Pennyworth shoots back, "It's called honesty, Alfie." That's when Alfie tells her about the peace talks and the fact that the war should be over pretty soon. There's nothing to worry about. He then tells his mom that he will sort this out with Gully. The thing is, he has to go find him. This whole time he's been waiting for him to show up, but he can't keep living like this. Alfie figures the next day he'll go searching for Gully, and he's going to do it alone. He's very adamant to Dave Boy that he is not to be followed. He has to do this by himself. As Alfie heads to bed, not too far away, Thomas Wayne heads to Martha's place to have some adult fun. And it's pretty ironic when Thomas brings up the fact that he always has a condom on him because, well, he clearly didn't use it the first time they had sex. And that's a pretty good lead-in for Martha to tell Thomas that she's expecting. So the good news is he doesn't have to use that condom in his wallet. But, the bad news is he's going to be a father. I guess it's bad news however way you look at it. But for Thomas, he's surprised, but then he suggests that the two get married, do this thing right. And Martha doesn't really have any interest in getting married to him. They start getting in a little bit of a fight about whether they have to get married or not, and it leads to Martha just leaving her own apartment. The next day is Lord Harwood's funeral, and as most of London watches on the television, Alfie heads to go find Gully. Gully's not hard to find. He's literally at home, although his home has been trashed, completely torn apart, and there's just Gully sitting in a chair watching the funeral go down. Gully asks Alfie, "Why are you here?" And Alfie tells him, "I owe you a fair crack." And Gully starts chuckling because he realizes that Alfie thinks he can take him, and he finds that hilarious. What he finds even more hilarious is that Alfie walked into an ambush. Out of the back room and the kitchen come two people from Gully's crew with guns pointed at Alfie. This isn't going to go at all as Alfie expected. Gully and his second-in-command, Monty, take Alfie to the forest, while the woman in Gully's crew just stays back at his place. They tie Alfie up, and Gully tells Alfie he has to even the odds. He stabs Alfie, telling him that Melanie stabbed him, so now they're even though Gully has healed up from his wounds. Monty then hands Alfie a knife, and Alfie can't believe that it's really come to this. He really just thought he could come in there and get his ass kicked, but clearly it's not going to go down like that. At gunpoint, Gully tells Alfie, "I'm going to give you a 5-minute head start. Run." So Alfie does. He takes off running in the forest, but that wound is really, really bad. Eventually, he just has to keel over next to a tree and wait for Gully to show up. And it takes a little bit longer than expected, but eventually Gully arrives. They have a talk about the whole Melanie situation, and then it gets down to hand-to-hand combat. Even with the bad stab wound, Alfie's holding his own. But with all that time that Alfie had to wait for Gully, he rigged up a trap. And when he backs up far enough, a tree ends up flinging around and stabbing Gully in the side. And Gully starts laughing. He finds it completely ironic because he's the one who taught Alfie how to rig this thing up. And even more ironically, he ended up killing the guy who taught him. But Alfie's not going to kill him. Even though Gully is badly injured, he's not going to finish him off. He tells Gully that he actually appreciates him, and he starts trying to stumble his way out to the woods. But luckily for Alfie, once his mom found out that he went to go after Gully alone, she lost it on Dave Boy, demanding that they go find him. So just like Alfie, the first place that Dave Boy looked was Gully's home, and that's where he found the woman from Gully's crew. Both Dave Boy and Mrs. Pennyworth beat her up and got the location out of her, and when they get to Alfie, he's in rough shape. But the first thing that Alfie says to Dave Boy is, Gully's in the woods and he needs an ambulance. Dave Boy and his mom then help Alfie up, and they escort him to the car. So it was a really busy day for Alfie, but it was also a busy day for England. As I said earlier, Lord Harwood's funeral was broadcast on television. There weren't many people in attendance. Two people that were in attendance, though, were the Sykes sisters. And they noticed that there's some blonde they've never seen before who is making eyes at John Salt. The Sykes sisters are still out for revenge, so they file that away. But Salt gets up there and gives an impassioned speech to England, doing so in Harwood's name, but it's all about doing your duty and staying the course. No doubt that the Queen and Aziz are probably regretting their leniency on letting Harwood's funeral party through the city. After the funeral, the Sykes sisters follow this blonde to a playhouse. It turns out she's an actress. And the actress, who's named Vicky, tries to be a prima donna with the Sykes sisters, but learns pretty quickly it doesn't go that well when you try to do that. They're able to find out that Vicky is John Salt's girlfriend, and that is just the revenge that they needed. They escort Vicky back to their sex shop, and they're planning on killing her and sending her head back in a box to Salt. But when Katie finds out about this, she puts a stop to it. Katie tells Bette, "You promised me, no more violence." And Bette tells her, "I did, but, this is different. Lord Harwood was my friend, and he was good to me, and I'm not going to betray him. This is rightful revenge." But Katie doesn't agree with that at all. Katie's not defending Salt, she just figures there's other ways to punish him. Seems like Bette really isn't agreeing with this line of thinking, so Katie tells her, "If you hurt this woman, I'm going to leave you." It changes Bette's mind. The problem is they can't exactly let Vicky go, so they tie her up and put her in the storefront, just like they did with the rapist. But now they're going to have to figure out what to do about Salt. Now, just as agreed upon, after the funeral, Salt was busy with the, quote, peace talks. But when he arrives at the Queen's castle, he's turned off by the fact that they have a summary of some of their positions, like where to break up territories and whatnot. He tells them that he feels like this is a list of demands, and they have no leverage in this. He says to Aziz, "This is not a negotiation, this is peace talks." And when Aziz doesn't see the difference, he tells him that negotiations are when both parties have something to trade. Peace talks are when one side has their foot on the other side's throat. Now that Salt knows that the League has seen how Stormcloud works, he's using it to his advantage. So he's demanding that they surrender London. He gives them 48 hours to think it over. Both Aziz and the Queen can't believe the general will sanction Stormcloud to be unleashed on its people, but the way he looks at it, just as many people will die if they have to fight their way into London. At least this speeds it up. It puts the League in a really tough spot. And when you're facing certain death, you want to do it with, somebody. So the Queen and Aziz end up hooking up. A little bit of a fall from grace from the Queen because she went from Alfie to Aziz. But there's one last thing that Salt has to do. He has to get the vote of approval from the union's board. He goes and he meets with everybody and he makes his pitch that he feels like he's done the job and he's ready to step into Harwood's shoes. And luckily for Salt, everybody agrees. But the last board member to agree is Mr. Pennyworth, who is basically a robot at this point, cemented
In
to a
episode
wheelchair.
9, Alfie doesn't
but
have much
still
time to be on the
very
mend
much alive.
because his friends stop by the next day to see how he's doing, but more importantly, to get help with Stormcloud. The deadline is quickly approaching. They realize that they need to do something about it, and that something is sneaking into the Raven Union's office and just stealing it. Alfie's mom is completely against it. She doesn't want her son to be in any more harm's way. Combine that with the fact that Alfie does call it a suicide mission, she's really against it. But Alfie says, "I thought it was a suicide mission before I got involved." But even despite her best efforts, Alfie is in. So it's going to be Alfie, Thomas Wayne, Dave Boy, and Professor Fox. Thomas Wayne figures that he can get them in because he's still a U.S. diplomat. And with the U.S. back in the Ravens, it shouldn't be an issue. They're going to pose as bringing Fox back. Then they just have to sneak in, find the location of Stormcloud, steal it, and get out without anyone noticing. But even though Alfie is involved now, it really doesn't make it any less dangerous. They're literally sneaking into enemy territory. And at this point, Alfie's face is pretty famous. It's very likely that he could get recognized and caught. So he wants to make good on something. That night, he stops by Sandra's home and apologizes to her. He tells her that he's going on this job the next day and he's scared. He doesn't want to be alone. She figures it's a line, but he says, "No, Sandra, it's true." To Sandra, though, that's not enough. So he looks her in the eye and says, "I'm sorry that I love you too much to not let you down. We could have kids and all that, and I know I'd be very happy. But one day I'd up and leave you and break your heart. Then I'd be ashamed for the rest of my life." But Alfie used the L word, and that works. So he heads in, and him and Sandra do the damn thing one last time, and Alfie doesn't have to spend the night alone. Dave Boy and Fox spent the night drinking with Aziz, and Thomas Wayne spent the night banging on Martha's door begging her to marry him.
When she asks why he wants to marry her so badly, he says, "Because I love you. Why else?" And she tells him, "I guess I love you too." So this is a big episode for love. But even with that out of the way, it's not as simple for Martha. So Thomas tells her, "Well, let me make it more simple for you. I'm going on a mission where I might not come back. So if I don't come back, do you want to be able to say something nice to our kid about me? Or will you have to say that I asked you to marry me and you said no?" Martha concedes the fact that Thomas has a point, and while it's not a yes, it's also not a no. But Thomas will take it at this point because it's just progress. And the enemy? Well, Salt spent the night getting a phone call from Vicky. He's unaware of the fact that Vicky is being held at knife point by the Sykes sisters, who are trying to lure Salt to them, but it doesn't work. He's just too busy. So through Bette's urging, Vicky is able to procure an invitation to him. So the next day, the Sykes sisters, along with Vicky, are going to be heading into the Raven Union's headquarters, and they'll have their face-to-face with Salt, hopefully. The next day, the group of Alfie, Thomas, Fox, and Dave Boy head over to the Raven Union. They're able to easily get in using the American disguise. And when they get in the elevator, they take out all of the Raven Union guards. Fox then puts the key into the basement where they created Stormcloud, and the group is now in phase 2 of the mission. The other scientists are pretty surprised to see Fox back. And before he seals it, Fox reams them all out for doing what they're doing, creating such a device as Stormcloud. Now, Fox has to be very, very careful with Stormcloud. It's the only one of its kind. They don't have any backups, but the device is in basically a little tiny light bulb, and if it gets destroyed, everybody in a 5-mile radius dies. So in order to keep the device secure and safe, Alfie has brought a tin. It looks like a tobacco tin. Nothing but the best. They then move on to phase 3 of the plan, getting the hell out of there. They take the elevator up, and they're almost out of the building when they're caught. Because when Salt found out that the CIA station chief was in the building, he decided he wanted to go meet him. But he saw all the bodies in the elevator, and he knew something was up. So the Raven Union is quickly able to surround them, take back Stormcloud, and put them in jail. A little while later, Alfie ends up calling up Aziz, while Salt holds the phone up for him and telling Aziz what happened to him. Salt then hops on the phone and reminds Aziz that he has until 4 p.m. for the deadline. If he doesn't hear back from him, they're using Stormcloud on London. Salt then starts beating the hell out of Alfie with the telephone, and he doesn't really care too much when Thomas Wayne brings up the fact that Alfie has, quote, rights. Salt just shoots back, "Well, I'm violating them." Unfortunately for the group, there's nothing they can do. They're all locked up in cages, so the best that they can do to help Alfie is by yelling at Salt, and it's not working. Salt, however, thinks he might be able to use Alfie. He takes him up to his penthouse suite, and he starts pitching Alfie on coming to work for the Raven Union. Salt kind of figured this would happen, so he leaves the room, and that's when Mr. Pennyworth wheels himself in. Alfie's so shocked at first he figures it's a dream, but his dad yells at him, "It's not a dream." And then he runs into him to prove the fact that he's not a dream. Alfie tells his father, "I'm happy to see you, but Mom has been grieving about you ever since you died, or allegedly. She was broken. And all the while, you're just rolling around up here, happy as a clam." Mr. Pennyworth admits that he missed his wife terribly, but he just didn't want her to see him like this. And Alfie doesn't understand what he's talking about, as he asks his father, "Like what? Alive? Mom would want to see you, despite all that you've done." But Mr. Pennyworth just doesn't think that his wife would forgive him. And Alfie assures him, "Oh, she would. She's too kind." But then Alfie gets to the point of why he's actually there. He asks his father, "You know they're going to drop a terror bomb on your wife, right?" And the way Mr. Pennyworth looks at it, it's a great sacrifice for an amazing cause. And that's when Alfie just starts yelling at his father about how arrogant, how narrow-minded he is. And when Mr. Pennyworth asks Alfie to join him on the Raven Union side, Alfie gets even angrier. It's clear that Alfie is currently in a fit of rage, even though he's tied up, so Mr. Pennyworth just leaves the room. A little while later, Alfie is escorted back down to the prison, and he fills everybody in on the fact that his dad is alive and well. Fox, though, can't figure out why Salt did what he did, meeting with Alfie and then letting Alfie meet with his father. As he tells the group, Salt doesn't do things for sentimental reasons. He's definitely got a plan. Fox just can't figure out what it is. And while getting Alfie on the side was the initial plan, Salt knew that it was a long shot, so they have to go to the backup plan. The backup plan is going to be using Mr. Pennyworth to deploy Stormcloud, sacrificing himself for the betterment of the cause, and ultimately winning the Raven Union the war. But as the guys are just sitting in the cell, waiting to find out what the Raven Union's going to do to them, Alfie's surprised because he sees Bet. Bet, Vicky, and Peg were able to sneak into the facility thanks to Vicky. She's pretty recognizable there. Peg and Bet just pretended like they were a couple of other girls for Salt. They made their way down, they found Frances Gaunt, they apologized for Harwood, and they proceeded to try to get her out of there. But Alfie stops Bet, and Bet immediately recognizes him as Esme's fiancé. Bet unlocks the cages for all 4 guys, but before the Sykes sisters leave, Alfie asks, hey, can you guys spare a weapon? We really need it. We're trying to stop a terrible war crime here. And right away, Frances Gaunt knows what he's talking about, but the Sykes sisters really don't care. So Alfie plays to Bet's heart. He says, Bet, what would Esme do? And that's enough for Bet to wait for a guard to walk around the corner, pistol whip him, and steal his weapon for Alfie. The women then start trying to make their way to Salt, and they're caught by a guard, but the guard, just like seemingly everybody else, recognizes Vicky, so he escorts them up to the penthouse. Alfie and his group are also caught trying to leave. And before Salt can even see the Sykes sisters or his girlfriend, he has Alfie and his group brought in front of him because he's actually pretty impressed by the fact that they just keep coming back. With Mr. Pennyworth in the corner, his son pleads for him to see the light. He asks his dad, can't you see that this guy's nuts? The Raven Union guards, though, start beating on Alfie to shut him up, and that's when Salt tells all of them that there is a bright side to this, because all 4 of the guys have something to offer. He starts off with Dr. Fox. He suggests that he get back in the lab and start working for them, but Dr. Fox says no. He then looks at Thomas Wayne and says, well, you could make a great bargaining chip. You could make a detailed statement, but Thomas cuts him off and says no. He then looks at Dave Boy and says, well, you would make a great soldier, but Dave Boy says absolutely not. But before Salt can get to Alfie, Mr. Pennyworth asks Salt, can I have some time alone to have some words with my son? Maybe I can persuade him to see some sense come over to our side. And considering the fact that Mr. Pennyworth is about to sacrifice himself for the betterment of the Raven Union, Salt says, yeah, that's fine. And then he leaves the room. But when Mr. Pennyworth wheels over to his son, Alfie tells him, don't waste your time. Mr. Pennyworth, though, says, Alfie, do you really think your mother would forgive me? And Alfie once again says, yes. So Mr. Pennyworth whispers to Alfie that there's a gun in his left pocket. And Alfie grabs it and shoots the rest of the guards. The idea of being reunited with his wife, who he misses dearly and loves, was just too much for Mr. Pennyworth. So right as it seemed absolutely bleak, and I'm talking the queen is left and Aziz is waiting to die, he gets a phone call from Alfie, who fills him in on the fact that they're heading back and they've got Stormcloud. But they've also got Mr. Pennyworth strapped into the car, looking forward to being reunited with his wife. And in the season finale, as soon as they get far enough where they think they're safe, Alfie stops the car and he starts telling his dad what a good decision it was to finally see the light. But it turns out his dad didn't really see the light. He still hopes London falls. He still wants the League to lose. He just figures that they're going to lose anyway. What does it matter if he helps out? He wants to see his wife again. They then get back in the car and they head back to London, where when Thomas Wayne and Fox return to the League, everybody's in high spirits. It's understandable. They have Stormcloud with them. Martha Kane especially is relieved that Thomas is back, and she agrees to marry him. Everybody congratulates them, and then they wait to hear from the Raven Union. Dave Boy headed home, as did Alfie, but he doesn't just roll through the door with his father. He sits his mom down, and he starts bracing her for it, asking her, if Dad were here now, what would you say? But she thinks it's ridiculous because, in her mind, her husband is dead. But that's when Alfie explains, well, Mom, we never saw the body. I found the body, and he's very much in it. Even after Alfie says this to her, she still doesn't believe him until Mr. Pennyworth rolls in the door, and she is so shocked that she faints. Alfie then gives his mom and dad some time to catch up and talk about why exactly he ghosted her, as he just goes and makes tea. As the Pennyworths are catching up, over at the League offices, somebody is looking for Alfie, and that somebody is Gully Troy. He stopped by the Pennyworth household earlier in the day, and he was looking for Alfie. But Mrs. Pennyworth said, he's not here. He went back to work for the League. So on that tip, Gully barges through the door with gun in hand, demanding to know where Alfie is. But Aziz tells him he's not here. And Aziz,
worried that this guy, who he has no idea who he is there to steal Stormcloud, ends up trying to hide it, but Gully sees that he's concealing something. He goes to grab it, and Stormcloud falls to the ground, releasing a blue cloud. Initially, everybody panics until they realize, wait a minute, we're not dead. And that's because that Stormcloud is a fake. John Salt didn't just leave Stormcloud sitting on a desk unattended. It's a dummy. That is why the League hasn't heard from the Raven Union yet. They're not concerned at all. But now their enemy is very concerned. Because if they're not in possession of Stormcloud, then they might be really screwed. The deadline is passed, and they haven't conceded defeat. Back over at Raven HQ, Salt explains all of this to the General, and the General realizes, oh my god, you wanted this all along. You wanted to unleash Stormcloud. And it's true. I mean, John all but admits it. But when the General explains that he's never going to sanction such a thing, Salt has him arrested. He's planning on deploying Stormcloud, and he has the trigger ready to go. In fact, he tells the General Stormcloud is already in central London. That's when he gets word that League HQ is on the line, and it's Aziz looking to take him up on the offer of surrender. But Salt says, no, it's too late. You guys thought you had won. You thought you had Stormcloud. You didn't. Now you have to pay. Don't worry. I'll give you enough time to say your goodbyes. But I'm not going to give you enough time to escape. Aziz then hangs up the phone and tells the group in HQ that they can try, but there's not going to be enough time for them to get to safety. Martha and Thomas decide to spend their last minutes on Earth going through with the promise that they made a few minutes ago. They get married as Aziz performs the ceremony. Aziz then realizes that he should probably notify Pennyworth. He did have a big hand of trying to bring Stormcloud down. So he calls Pennyworth up and explains that it was a dud the whole time. And that's when Pennyworth realizes his father really didn't have a change of heart. He wanted to come and have one last goodbye with his wife because he knew his wife would end up dying that day. Mr. Pennyworth starts to give her the same speech he gave Alfie about great changes cause great pain and great sacrifice, and this is just a sacrifice that he's willing to make for the cause. But that's a really tough sell when you're telling it to people that are about to die from a terror bomb. Everybody kind of calms down for a little bit. Mr. Pennyworth apologizes to his wife, saying, I know you can't forgive me, but she cuts him off and says, did I say that? I mean, I love you, and you love me, don't you? Well then, of course I forgive you. But Alfie makes it clear, I don't forgive you. He starts yelling at his father once again, and he grabs a picture of Alfie as a child with his father out of Mr. Pennyworth's hands, and he smashes it on the ground. But when his mom yells at him for it, he picks the picture back up and hands it to his dad. His dad, looking at the picture of himself as a younger father, just says aloud, I was wrong, and I'm sorry. And maybe it's the emotional sentiment. Maybe it's the fact that he was just forgiven by his wife, who he never thought would forgive him. But he tells the group, it's not too late. I know where Stormcloud is. And Stormcloud is indeed in London. Mr. Pennyworth tells Alfie, it's in Lord Harwood's crypt. It was snuck into the city weeks ago. So Alfie frantically calls up Aziz, and him and Dave Boy head over to the crypt to take care of it before it can be deployed. Now, the only reason it hasn't been deployed yet is because Salt is basking in this moment. So much so that he heads up to the penthouse apartment where he's going to deploy it, but that's when he's stopped by the Sykes sisters. So as the Sykes sisters are beating the hell out of him, Alfie and Dave Boy are able to locate the crypt, bust it open, and sure enough, there's Stormcloud. But they're stopped by some rando with a gun who thinks that they're just grave robbers. Even after they explain, hey man, there's a bomb in here, the guy still doesn't stop, demanding that they put their hands up and they walk out. They're not willing to do that. He ends up shooting, and now they're pinned down. But that rando ends up getting killed by Gully Troy. Gully had a change of heart after he realized that the entire city was in danger, so he's back on Alfie's side. He's also with Lucius Fox. So Fox starts trying to take care of the bomb, but then all of a sudden, it triggers. And that's because even though Salt was getting his ass beat, he was able to grab the detonator and press the button. And now it's just a matter of a minute or two before London is all terrorized to death. The only way really to stop it is to put it in a pressurized capsule and throw it underwater, and they don't have the time to do that. So Alfie suggests that he just swallow it. Stormcloud is about the size of a pill anyway. Fox tells him it's probably not going to work, but they don't have a better option. But right before he's able to do it, Gully says, no, I'm not letting you do that. I'm still the superior officer here. I'll do it. And Gully swallows it. He, Alfie, Dave Boy, they all have a good laugh. They do their army salute that they always do.
But then Gully starts to feel it. You see him literally turn blue and keel over. But to Fox's amazement, nobody else dies. Stormcloud was seemingly kept in the body. He can't figure out how, but he figures it had to do with something about the enzymes. But Gully Troy's sacrifice ends up saving the entire city. Gully isn't taken out of the church by a normal coroner. Because he's filled with Stormcloud, he's taken by the toxic containment unit. But just as the truck is about to leave, all of a sudden, everybody outside starts hearing banging. And then there's a blue glow. And then they start hearing yelling. Despite Lucius Fox telling Alfie he probably shouldn't open it, Alfie does. And he's surprised because Gully Troy is still alive. But then again, the rest of London is still alive, so that's good. Back at the Pennyworth household, Mrs. Pennyworth thanks her husband for being sensible, and he says, "I'm not being sensible, I'm being sentimental." He then tells his wife, "It's so good to see you again. It makes everything worthwhile." She looks at him and says, "Well, I should hope so. I love you too." God knows why. But then Mr. Pennyworth stops responding, because she didn't notice that he pulled the plug on himself. So the last words he heard from his wife were, "I love you." It's a nice ending for Mr. P. Wasn't a good ending for John Salt, though. He thought he had won. He thought he deployed Stormcloud. He didn't, though. And the general for the army busts open the door and lets him know, your plan didn't work. Salt is arrested, Francis Gaunt takes over the Union, and the Raven Union is going to rebrand. Fast forward 6 months later, and the war is still raging on. Thomas Wayne and Martha have continued to live in London. Martha is very pregnant. And as the new Raven Alliance makes a charge for the city once again, Martha's ready to go to battle, but that's when her water breaks. A little while later, she gives birth to a very healthy baby girl. Yeah, I didn't see that coming. But there's an alert on the television for all League forces to go to their posts and defend the city. And some of those people include Katie Browning, who is defending the city along with Bet Sykes. They're pretty pinned down, it's looking bleak, and that's when Alfie shows up with the League's secret weapon. The secret weapon is Gully Troy, who looks like he's dressed in a getup for diving, but it's more to harness his new abilities. Because when he unleashes his power, a blue light shoots out of his fists and destroys all of the opposing soldiers. And that is how Season 2 of Pennyworth ends. Thank you so much for getting this point of the recap. I really appreciate it. Consider subscribing to the channel. I have merch. You can buy that. I also have a Patreon. The link's in the bio, so you can support me and you get stuff in return. Be nice in the comments section. Nasty comments make me feel bad. Thumbs up, thumbs down, all that good stuff. I'll see you for Season 3.